Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Juan Larrosa is a researcher in the Department of Sociocultural Studies at ETESO University in Mexico, where he teaches at the School of Journalism and Public Communication. Fatima Go, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Juan in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Fatima will tell us more about Juan's research and career in just a minute. Then, Juan will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time during Juan's presentation, or even when the Q&A has started. It's at the bottom of your screen. Fatima will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Fatima, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo, for that opening. My name is Fatima Gao. I'm a first-year Media Technology Society student from Northwestern University, and I am honored to introduce our featured scholar for today. Professor Juan Larrosa is an associate professor at the Department of Sociocultural Studies at ETESO University in Mexico. He is also the coordinator of ETIU's Communication and Culture Observatory at the same institution, and a member of the Mexico's National Research System. He obtained his PhD in Media and Communication from Temple University in Philadelphia, United States, his Master's in Communication from the University of Guadalajara, and his Bachelor's in Communication Studies from ETESO University. His research interests revolve around public and political communication, journalism, political economy of communication and culture, and media observatories. Professor Larrosa has over 60 journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers, and have published 2 books. Just this year, he was awarded the 2022 Klein Carnell Rising Scholar Award at Temple University, on top of many numerous other recognitions for his research on political communication in the Latino community. Today, he will talk about the use of public communication infrastructure to fight the COVID-19 pandemic in Mexico. Let's all welcome Professor Juan Larrosa.
Well, thank you, Fatima, so much for this presentation. And thank you, Pablo and Facundo and Val and Mora and Catalina for inviting me to this presentation. I'm very excited. I'm talking from Guadalajara, which is a city in Mexico, nearly at the center west of Mexico, here at ETESO University. So thank you so much for being here. And today, yes, I will present you research about what we're observing around COVID-19 and public communication. So let me just first share you my presentation, and let's begin. So the title for today's presentation is Infrastructuring Public Communication System to Fight a Pandemic. So to begin, I would like to start with a brief mental exercise. So I want you to imagine the story that I'm going to tell you. Imagine a community of just a few dozen people. This community is small, far from the cities in which most of us inhabit this planet. In this community, there are no technologies for transportation and communication as we know them today. Nor do they have weapons of mass destruction, scientific method, or many other things of our contemporary life. But the community does know and use language. Now imagine that suddenly, and without any warning, a very great danger develops for the community that threatens its existence. The community faces a constant attack by wild animals. They had never seen these animals before, but very soon they realize that they can kill people. What does this group of people do to save their lives? The first thing is to collect information about the threat that looms over the community. Through dialogue and interactions, they produce knowledge about the problem that threatens them and agree on the measures to alleviate that threat. The second step is to communicate this knowledge to all the members of the community. And the third step is to organize themselves to implement the measures that they have designed on the basis of the knowledge they have built together. And they manage to survive as a community. So much for the imagination exercise. But I ask you to keep this in your mind for the rest of the presentation. So, as you have probably already noticed, all the practices put it into action by the community, by this imagined community, are structured by public communication processes. It is public because it refers to the shared interest of a collectivity. The shared interest is to collectively survive the animal attack. This brief exemplification of what public communication is and its importance for collective life and survival is the conceptual basis for the work I am presenting to you today. Just as a small and imaginary community sought to collectively survive the attack, humanity in the 21st century did the same to face COVID-19, a disease caused by a previously unknown virus. As in the fictitious example, the survival of humanity depended to a large extent on millions of communicative practices that allowed the production of knowledge about the virus, its distribution through complex communication systems, and the organization of collective actions to face the pandemic. So there are three actions important here: knowledge production, knowledge distribution, and collective action. All of these actions are structured by communication practices. So let me tell you a little bit about the research context of what I'm going to present you today. This work came about in April of 2020, just 1 month after the WHO declared the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember those days when many of us, or at least me, I don't know you, tried to go on with life with a certain normality. We had to get up and shower at the same time that we did during non-COVID times in order to not fall into a depression. Then we have to prepare classes, write articles, and attend university Zoom meetings that become like an eternal loop in our lives. Then we have to prepare All of these, as if we were not at the beginning of a pandemic with the lowest oil prices in history and an economic crisis lurking. So the first thing that happened to me was to realize that things were serious and that we were in a big trouble as humanity. Afterwards, I remember spending several days pondering what I could do to help in this situation. And after meditating, the best thing I could think of was to start researching about the pandemic. That's the thing I know how to do. So I have never worked in the field of health communication, but I was very into public and political communication. And that's where the first pulse for this work came from. Then I thought it was a great opportunity to work as a team. And I launched a call on Facebook for a collaborative research project. I literally posted, hey, do you want to collaborate with me in a research? I don't know exactly what we're gonna do, but just send me an email or send me a WhatsApp. That's how we put together a wonderful group of 6 women, some professors, other students, all of them experts in communication issues. 2 of them, because of personal reasons, just left the team, but they work very hard, and we are now a team of 4 people that you are seeing on screen. Rosalia Orozco Murillo from Guadalajara University, Sofia Palau, she works here at ITESO University, and Julia Gomez, who she was a student here at ITESO University, and now she is at the University of California. So the objective of our research was basic, very basic, and related to the fictional story I just told. Our interest was to observe how a federal government in a country of 130 million people in the global south used communication, specifically public communication, to deal with the pandemic. So we started doing a live ethnography of the press conferences that since February of 2020, the Mexican federal government organized to report on the pandemic. We made a coding sheet and organized who was going to observe which day of the press conferences. And now, I'm happy to tell you that we are a few months away from finishing writing a book with our findings, a book which I hope to share with you very soon. So specifically what I'm going to present you today deals with infrastructures and communication. Today, in particular, I would like to present the work that shapes the first chapter of the book that we are writing. There, we start from the premise that every communicative practice or any communicative system requires an infrastructure for its operation. If you think about it, you cannot do any communication practice with physical infrastructures. The infrastructures could be an assemblage of human bodies or an assemblage of satellites, human bodies, antennas, and many other things. But any communication practice or system requires an infrastructure for its operation. So from that point of view, I will seek to answer the following question. What infrastructure did the federal government in Mexico assembled for the operation of a public communication system for the production and distribution of knowledge about the pandemic? If you remember in the story, 2 important elements was producing knowledge about what was happening and then disseminating that knowledge to all the community. To do so, I propose the concept of infrastructural reconversion. What does this mean? Infrastructural reconversion is a process through which an infrastructure or a set of infrastructures is used for a different purpose for which the original infrastructure was created. This reconversion results in the creation of a new infrastructure. The design of the new infrastructure presents a mixture of the values with which the original infrastructure was designed with the values of the actor, which can be individual or collective, that makes this reconversion. Conversion processes can be motivated by multiple causes. One of them may be a social and health crisis, such as the emergence of a pandemic. These reconversions are relevant to study from a communication point of view, as it allows us to see how the actor program the infrastructures through actions, practices, and discourses, and therefore how these actions, practices, and discourses create and organize human communities. So I will divide my presentation into 4 parts. First, I will give a brief socio-political contextualization of the historical present in Mexico. I think that's very important to understand what's happening. Then I will present an analysis and description of the infrastructures that the government assembled to produce knowledge. And in the third part, I will do the same, but about the infrastructures that were put in operation to disseminate that knowledge. And finally, in the last part, I will present the conclusions. So here is a historical and socio-political context in which the pandemic arrived in Mexico. An important element to present is that in 2018 in Mexico, we had a presidential election. And for the first time in Mexico history, arrived a leftist government. Many people in Mexico would dispute the idea that López Obrador is a leftist politician, but at least in the general discourse, we can say that. This came after the 20th century. There was a semi-authoritarian regime in Mexico, and then 2 periods where a party from the right wing governed Mexico, and then a period where another party, center party, governed Mexico. So 2010 was important in this sense. López Obrador, which is normally called AMLO, began with high popularity. He arrived with 30 million votes and high levels of approval by the Mexican population. However, and this is still true today, he has a high approval in the large population, but at the same time, he has a high disapproval by political elites. And by political elites, I mean politicians, journalists, intellectuals, businessmen, businesswomen, all these elites that have power in a country. So the pandemic arrived 15 months after the election. And this is important because Mexico was in a process of change. In a way, AMLO is changing not only the public discourse, but also in very specific public policies. He was changing the health system. He disappeared some institutions. He tried to build new institutions in the health sector. And he was making several changes during the country. And just in the middle of those changes and in the middle of these political disputes between the federal government and political elites arrived the pandemic. Another important element of the historical and socio-political context in Mexico, it's the federal government's communication. In terms of this theory that it's very well known now, López Obrador and his crew, they built a hybrid political communication assemblage, which was made basically by a daily press conference, which is a very strange practice. The president every day wakes up and at 7 in the morning, he's giving a press conference, which sometimes could be 3 hours or maybe more. In the first part of the conference, he gives a long speech, and then he starts talking with some the journalists that are present in the press conference. But every day, he from Monday to Friday, he gives press conferences. And in these press conferences, sometimes he invites members of his government, the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Health. They join him regularly and talk with the press. Also, there's a ground game where every weekend, I would say Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, he travels around the country, but and he talks and he goes and to travel to different states of Mexico, and he talks with politicians, but he also talks with regular people. He has rallies and he has big gatherings, and he makes an important connection with regular people during these travels. And finally, he uses a lot a digital ecosystem for distributing information. His press conferences are broadcast through YouTube, through Facebook, through Twitter. He uses a lot all of these social networks, not only to broadcast the press conference, but to send information, to send ideas, to send videos about what's happening in the country. And this assemblage, and this communication strategy took a lot of power away from traditional media, which in the past had been a key piece in governing the country. So this is very important because AMLO also established a confrontational style toward media and journalists in a way as we can put many of these journalists and media outlets as part of the political elites that are against or are very critical about AMLO's administration. So this is very important because he changed the political communication model from previous administrations, where previous presidents had very tight relations with media barons and with certain journalists, and AMLO changed that in a way, not all for the better. I mean, he's very confrontational. Sometimes he's violent in verbal ways to the journalists and media. But the important idea that I want to locate here is that there is a big dispute between the federal government and an important part of media and journalists. So this socio-historical context is important to understand what I'm going to talk about, communication and infrastructures, because the pandemic arrived into Mexico in a time of polarization of political elites. Mexico has currently a public sphere that it's very contested, that is polarized. I would say that I don't see a polarization of all the population as it happens in other countries in Latin America or in other parts of the world. I still believe that it's only a polarization of political elites, but it's still an important phenomenon to understand. And well, here in the picture, you can see López Obrador arguing in his press conferences, in one of his press conferences with Jorge Ramos. Maybe you know these journalists. They have like a big debate in one of his press conferences about the insecurity in Mexico. So this socio-historical context framework offers a universe of possibilities under which the pandemic could be managed. In the public opinion in Mexico, there's a lot of saying about like, well, the Mexican government didn't do this and didn't do that. And it's an important critique, but sometimes it forgets that what were the conditions of the country when the pandemic arrived. So in this sense, as I told you, Mexico was experiencing transformation not the best one, I would say, but it was a transformation in the public health system. So that was very complicated to manage the pandemic in terms of health. But also it arrived with a public sphere very polarized, and I would like to say also with a public media system in a very bad shape. It was underfunded and extremely politicized and very dependent of the federal government with no independence or autonomy. So that was the moment when the pandemic arrived into the country. So let's begin with knowledge production. As I explained in the first part of the presentation, when I was talking about this mental exercise, about imagining this small community that needs to understand what's happening, the first thing to do is to create knowledge. In all the countries in the world, we were asking what is happening, what is this new virus that is attacking us, how can we be safe, what strategies we need to implement to be safe. We need to produce knowledge about what is happening to us. So the arrival of SARS-CoV-2 implied facing something unknown and required the production of knowledge about the pandemic's progress in the national territory. I would say that Mexico did not play an important role in terms of the epistemic networks of scientists of learning what was happening with the virus, but it was clearly very important to know what was happening inside the Mexican territory. I mean, who was getting, how many people was getting infected, how many people were dying, what were the conditions of the hospitals for attending all these people. And during the first months of the pandemic, the federal government spoke about hospital reconversion, which implied converting hospitals and health centers into spaces for exclusive care of COVID patients. Basically, what the Mexican federal government did was, okay, I'm gonna take all of these hospitals and I'm gonna make them just for COVID patients. And that's where when we thought that it could be interesting to play with this idea of reconversion and where the infrastructural reconversion concept emerged. So the argument here is that in the same way the government made with the hospital reconversion, the government also need to perform an infrastructural reconversion for the production of knowledge of what was happening in the pandemic. To do so, the government used the infrastructure that support the Sentinel model. This model was built and developed during 2010 after the H1N1 pandemic. I don't know if you remember, it was a smaller pandemic than COVID pandemic, but it was still an important threat for human health. So what's the logic of the Sentinel model? The logic of this model is to collect samples of possible infections of acute respiratory diseases through health centers distributed throughout the country. The model works as a dynamic survey that allows to know the progress of the pandemic or the progress of the reproduction of the spread of a virus. In addition, the federal government collected samples from public and private hospitals throughout the country. However, Mexico refused to follow the World Health Organization's recommendation to apply tests, and more tests. There was a moment where the WHO was saying, like, the important thing here is to make as much as tests as possible to find how many people were infected. And Mexico, during several months, stick to the idea of just using the Sentinel model. Moreover, the Ministry of Health, well, all of this information that we're collecting through the Sentinel model and also through all the network of hospitals were sent through these systems to the Ministry of Health, where many people were gathering all this information and consolidating it. And then the National Council of Science and Technology developed models for the analysis of this information and developed the National Informatics System. You can see here a picture of this system, where statistics on the progress of COVID in Mexico were published, and they're still being published nowadays. So you can find the number of cases of people that were infected with COVID, the people who might have COVID, the people who have died, the people who are hospitalized, and many other things. There are models to predict the spread of the virus in Mexico. So in a nutshell, the infrastructure that supported a communication system that made it possible to transport information on what was happening on the ground. I mean, they were able to collect information from people who were sick, for people that were in hospitals, from people who were dying, and send all this information to the Ministry of Health, and then send it to the public sphere through different communication practices. So there were several criticisms of this knowledge production. In a way, the knowledge production was concentrated. One of the biggest criticisms was that all of these tasks were concentrated in the Ministry of Health, and the Mexican federal government did not use some other institutions that could help to manage the pandemic and to create decisions that include more technicians, more people that were not exclusively working in the federal government. The knowledge production was not public. They were only just telling us the decisions, but we didn't know how they produced this knowledge of what was happening, and there was a lack of plurality, right? Because only the people who were working in the government were able to talk about this, and were able to have a saying on how this thing was and how the knowledge production was working. So in theoretical terms, the importance of all this is that every communication system requires an infrastructure to operate. These infrastructures are programmed based on the values of those who produce them. In the Mexican case, the infrastructure supported a communication system for production of knowledge programmed under these values, which were concentration, centralization, a lack of plurality, and a lack of transparency. And this is in partly explained by the Mexican socio-political situation of high friction and polarization between elites and government. I mean, the government didn't want help from all these scientists, from other political elites. So the other thing, after producing knowledge, the other important thing is to distribute knowledge among the population. So the Mexican federal government had the task to distribute knowledge to 130 million people. So for doing this, the first step was what we call the knowledge translation. You cannot send all the information produced by scientists and by all the bureaucrats of the federal government to the population. So the Ministry of Health translated the knowledge generated into communicative products aimed to specific communities. For example, for 2 years, it produced a daily technical report. This document contained information on the progress of the pandemic at the global level, as well as a statistic describing the phenomenon at the national level. This document was useful for the media and journalists as they could find a summary of how the health crisis was developing. In addition, this ministry developed advertising campaigns such as Quédate en Casa and Susana Distancia, which sought to persuade people to confine themselves and keep social distance. This campaign included radio and television spots and a large number of materials for social networks. Another thing that the federal government did was a daily press conference, which was aired every day in the evening. And the government took up the WHO recommendation and held a daily press conference to inform the media and the population about the pandemic. In these conferences, many of the government's communication products and efforts converged. All of these advertising campaigns, all the technical reports, even the propagandistic informations and communication products were displayed on this daily press conference, which was led by Hugo López-Gatell, which was, well, he's a scientist, and at the same time, he is the deputy of the health minister. And all of these products, all of these communication products were distributed through a digital ecosystem, mainly through digital networks, and some of them through mass media. So once all of these materials had been developed, the government had to distribute them among the population. So here the assemblage was predominantly based on federal government's digital ecosystem, the same that the president used every day to distribute the information. So they used Facebook, they used Twitter, they used YouTube and WhatsApp. And in addition, they used the public media system of the federal government and distributed some information through radio and TV stations. So in short, what these tell us is that the government adapted the infrastructure and communication strategy that they normally use for the Mexican president to report on the pandemic and to distribute information about the pandemic. So which are the criticisms about this strategy? The first one is that the government relied primarily on the digital ecosystem. Most of the communication occurred through YouTube, through Facebook, or through Twitter. This is problematic when having a strong digital gap as in Mexico. I mean, this is criticized in a country where 34% of the population does not have access to the internet. This is about 45 million people, and where public media do not have a universal coverage as and have very low funding. This heavily reliance on digital communication really left out many people that normally do not use these social media platforms. And also, the government sometimes says that, well, we use radio and television, but mainly they use radio and TV stations from the public media system. The public media system only can service 60% of the population, and the public media system does not have a high rating when compared with the private radio and TV system, which basically gets to 100% of the population. So the federal government basically used their political communication infrastructure for distributing content during the pandemic. This order of things also can be explained by the historical and socio-political context. The president always had a very bad relationship with the press and media owners, and even during the pandemic, he refused to negotiate that with them to enhance his information distribution strategy. Some of the critics say that he could negotiate with these other media systems to make an infrastructural reconversion to offer the people more opportunities, more chances to get the information that we were talking about regarding the pandemic. So I'm gonna start just wrapping up. So the pandemic was managed in Mexico as in other countries of the world on the basis of certain universe of possibilities and no others. I mean, we cannot, specifically talking about communication, we could not expect to have a communication system such as in China with an authoritarian government, or maybe in a European country with a strong public media system. So in this sense, the universe of possibilities was conditioned by Mexican history and by the contemporary government. It was shaped by this political transformation. The pandemic came with a battered and changing healthcare system and a crumbling and underfunded public media system. With this infrastructure, the government had to produce and circulate knowledge about the pandemic through infrastructural reconversions. On the other hand, as has been documented in studies of political communication, an important thing to say here is that technologies and infrastructures are programmed based on the norms and values of those who create them. These values are a mixture of those who create the technologies and those who assemble the infrastructures. So a key element here was that the government sought to concentrate on centralized communication processes in the presidency of the Republic, the Ministry of Health, and other institutions generally located in Mexico City. Another element was the development of an image of a strong government that at no time sought to dialogue, discuss, or publicly evaluate its management strategies with political and social actors outside of the government. These characteristics allowed for an infrastructural reconversion that favored values of concentration, centralization, lack of plurality, and opacity. So an important lesson in epistemic terms is to build knowledge from an open, transparent, and plural deliberation. This can bring technical and political benefits. Technical benefits in the sense that you can have more people thinking about how to solve a problem, in this case, how to produce knowledge and how to distribute knowledge from a communicative point of view, and also political benefits in the sense that if you include more people from oppositional parties, that could be beneficial for the government. I mean, it is clear that in Mexico, we did not experience this political science phenomenon called rally around the flag. And mainly, the people were very critical about the manage of the pandemic. And also an important lesson in terms of knowledge distribution is in maintaining a public, autonomous, independent, and well-funded media system is a matter of national security, in the sense that you need as a government to have a media system or a communication system that really gets to all the population, and that the population really knows how to use that media system. So with this, I would like to wrap up. I would like to thank you, all of you, for listening to this. Here you can find a QR code if you want to read the chapter that I just presented and other papers that we have just wrote about this research. You can download them from my personal website. So thank you very much, and this is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Juan Larrosa Fuentes. We are now opening the floor to questions, and we encourage our attendees to send their questions in the Q&A box we have here in Zoom. But to get things rolling. I'm very thankful for the lecture discussion that you presented, Professor Larrosa, because I'm also a fan of media infrastructure and looking at how media infrastructure can serve the public. I noticed that in your framework of knowledge production, distribution, and the collective action, you weren't able to touch on the collective action bit, and I understand that the media infrastructure really has, an assumed usefulness to the citizen. So I wonder, with all dissemination in the digital media ecosystem, with mass media, with the daily press conference, etc., is there feedback from citizens of how useful those kinds of public communication is to their daily lives of navigating the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And I didn't have the time to just address that part, but it's also on the paper on the chapter that we are working on. And an important element is that the federal government never evaluated the strategy, not in real time and not afterwards. In the paper, we discussed that during the pandemic, the federal government did several serological surveys, for example, for learning how many people have been in contact with the virus, and to learn about the rates of infection of all the population, even of those who were not in the public health system. But they did not the same for understanding or for evaluating the communication strategy. We don't have any surveys, any focus groups, any evaluations of if this strategy was successful. We are as Mexicans, we can ask for information to the government, and they are obliged to respond. And we have asked if they have any of these kind of documents, or if there is any evaluation of the communication strategy, and they have just answered that they do not have anything of that. So we really don't know to how many people all of these messages arrive, they get. We don't know if they like it or not, if they learn something from that. So it's we really need to perform more research to understand what was the effect of all these communication strategy.
Thank you so much, Professor Larrosa. I'm sure it's part of your recommendation to integrate evaluation and critiques of the model. Let me call on Facundo. I think he has a question to ask.
Okay.
Sorry, Fatima. I think we have a question in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. I'll ask that.
No worries.
Okay. Oh, there's two questions here. Let me just read the question from Celeste Wagner. Thank you so much for sharing the research. Oftentimes, Mexico is regarded as an example of public national statistics, especially compared to other Latin American countries, where there have been more discontinuities, lack of standardization, etc. If you agree with this contextualization, do you think that data production during COVID was not grounded in this transition due to the specific government decisions, or maybe due to the nature of the issue? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that maybe compared with other Latin American countries, maybe in some cases Mexico is better, but that's not. But I mean, we're not in the clear there. I mean, we really need to improve all of these statistics, and I think that pretty soon the pandemic was politicized. And at the beginning, the people who were in charge of managing the pandemic were trying to make and take decisions using this kind of national statistics. But pretty soon, all the politics that I was trying to describe very briefly, it's a very complicated issue that it might take me just one presentation to discuss. We're shaping the decisions in Mexico. So that was not very helpful, because at the end they decided with information that was not shared with the population. And that's why I think it's very important to understand the epistemic nature of public communication, in the sense that if as a population we're able to learn or to see how knowledge is being produced by all these technicians, by all these scientists, and by all of these politicians, it would have political and technical benefits, and we lack of that during the pandemic. So I would say, Celeste, that COVID was not grounded in this tradition as you present this question. Thank you for the question, and I say you hola.
Thank you, Professor Larrosa. We have another question from Rosie Arroyo. How do you see the power of local media, given the fact that in Mexico, there are sometimes even marginalized from general federal policies? I think you covered that area. Do you think that in reinforcing them would help to the reconversion that you propose in the infrastructure in public communication?
Sure, I think that the local media, it's a very important issue here, and in many other countries, and an important research area in the sense that after all this pandemic and all the observations that we are dealing with during our research, I would say that a good communication strategies should involve first like a big umbrella where public communication can be displayed to the whole country and on all the population in the country. But then you need just regional and local communication systems and networks that can address specific problems or specific issues in those communities. It is not enough with just a big and panoramic message, because it's not the same a rural community in the south of Mexico that a urban community, as in the place that I live, which is a city of 5 million people, or another city that it's in the north. So I think that it needs to be an assemblage of infrastructures that cover a national dimension, and then regional and local dimensions, which we're far in Mexico from having that. And we also need to say that the historical moment and the historical moment where the pandemic arrived is a moment where local media are underfunded, and they have been swallowed by national and international media. So we don't have many local reporters now, and we don't have many local public media systems. So that's a very important element to understand and discuss for the future.
Thank you so much for your response. We have another question here from Guerrero Martinez Manuel Alejandro. Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. Do you think the number of cases, and most importantly of COVID diseases, was accurately reported? Or do you have evidence that such figures are influenced by a political criteria?
Yes, I don't have evidence of that, of doing that. I think from what we observed that they were definitely underreported, but not because of political things. I think it's because of lack of technical and human resources. Because I think I was listening yesterday to the news, INEGI, which is the institution in Mexico that produces the national statistics, they just announced the excess of people who died in the previous year. And obviously it was very, very high when compared with the number of people reported of that died by COVID. And then we can now estimate the number of people who died from COVID. And also, which I think was part of the political struggle in Mexico, in the website where they were reporting the cases, they had the estimate of people who died from COVID, not the official number, because the official number wasn't the people who died and where a doctor can actually certificate they died from COVID, but they had an estimate of people who have died of COVID, and it's and it coincides with the number of the excess of people who died in those years. So and that were numbers from the government. So I would say that the problem was that they never changed the strategy of counting the people who were dying and the people who were trying to and the way they were collecting the samples to learn how many people were infected. So and that was a very stubborn decision that was against what the WHO was recommending, and that was a political decision. And I think it was a regrettable decision, and it was not good for the country. So thanks, Manuel, and same to you.
Yes, I think it's also mentioned in your report how the government's whole process of collecting data was not transparent to begin with, so that is echoing that issue. Let us call on our last question. Facundo, go ahead.
Thank you, Fatima, and thank you, Juan, for this very important presentation. I was thinking, sort of related to Fatima's question, but more into conceptual, how you conceptualize infrastructure, and how if you see like evidence, or probably you talk this in other part of the book, and congratulations on the book, that's great also, about like the role that lay citizens and lay expertise had in shaping, like not only like in the effects of like how people perceive the communication, but how like their not their feedback, but the way that collective movement or social movement and like expertise in some way shape the reconversion of the infrastructure. If you have space, because at some point I was thinking that probably infrastructure was more like as a top-down thing, but also I'm thinking that conceptually you also have like a lot of like networks and objects as part of considering something an infrastructure. So this thing, and if you can also touch upon at least some words on that, what remain after, since we are like in a new phase of the pandemic now, what things of this infrastructure or this reconversion are still present in the communication, and what things have they gone with the past phase of the pandemic? So thank you.
Well, thank you, Facundo. That's a great question that touches first in a theoretical debate. And sure, I mean, I was not also able to just go in more detail about the theory of infrastructure, but I want to move from the idea that infrastructures are only the antennas and all of those things. Like an important part of the infrastructure are the people who are plugged into all these networks and to all these things that transport information, things, ideas from one place to another. And sadly, on what you're saying, what we are witnessing here in Mexico is that I don't know, because of the political moment and because of the turbulent and complicated times, it's just like we have just to move on. And I'm not seeing any effort to first to try to evaluate what happened in general, and in particular in the communication field. And I'm not seeing a government that is interested in saying, okay, we build now this new infrastructure. How can we study that infrastructure, and how can we improve that infrastructure, and how we can think about how can we use this infrastructure for future emergencies, and how can we invest in public media, how can we invest in telecom, how can we invest also in media literacy, because that's very important in terms of all this infrastructure. So they're just saying, okay, the pandemic is over, let's just move on, let's just as the hospitals that were converted to just COVID hospitals, and then now are as in the old times, the old hospitals, we're watching the same in the realm of communication. So I think that's an important thing for to learn, as I would say, as humanity, that we need better communication infrastructures that support better communication systems to manage and to use them during an emergency such as a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Juan. Those are perfect words with which to end this great seminar. Thank you very much for sharing this good research with us today. Thank you, Fatima, for excellent moderation, and to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us next week for a new installment of the seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thanks again, Juan. This was great.
Thank you so much, Pablo.
Bye now.